Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus, our weekly podcast in which our diplomatic reporter Lazar Berman explores the news that spins the globe. So I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, and today is Friday, March 7th, day 517 of the war. Lazar, thank you so much for joining me as always, and today from our Jerusalem office.
Good to be back. Good to be in the office with you.
It always is fun. And, you know, I would say that few outside of my close family know just how annoying I can be. And you are one of the exceptions. And why is that? Because for a while now, I've been bugging you to speak about Egypt. So listeners, with all of this prodding, this will be the focus of today's Friday Focus. Prodding pays off, right, Lazar?
It does. It does indeed. And I'm eager to see what else you prod me to talk about in the future.
Don't worry, I will. So I have a lot of questions about how we got to the state we are today with Egypt. And Egypt, of course, just proposed a day after plan with Gaza in which Hamas doesn't disarm and there's no real security for Israel. So I just have to think, if these are our friends, who needs enemies, right?
You know what? There have been people who've made that argument in the past. We'll talk about people who are making that argument now. But if you want to give my big picture argument that I'll be making, I think they are a very useful ally to have, and we shouldn't do anything that gets in the way of that.
All right. So let's just begin with the 3 times that Egypt actually waged war, or at least announced for war, declared war against Israel. And then there's, of course, the war of attrition. So let's start really with the foundation, or before the foundation of the state of Israel. And we'll go through very, very, very quickly at like 2 times speed, a bit of history, and then we'll slow down when we get to basically the past decade. Okay, so let's do it like that. So let's very quickly review Israel's relationship with Egypt.
Okay, so when we're talking about Israel's relationship with Egypt, I'll just take 30 seconds and talk about it goes well before the modern state of Israel. Indeed, Jews, the Jewish people in Egypt, have a relationship, an intense relationship that goes back into ancient times. Obviously, the Bible is full of stories about Egypt, most significantly what we'll celebrate with Passover, the Jews leaving Egypt, the Exodus. But then you look later into Jewish history, the time of the kingdoms in the land of Israel. Egypt was sometimes an important ally, sometimes an adversary, but there's no question that Egypt was the superpower in the area. Israel was generally caught between superpowers, and there was an ongoing, continuous, and often very productive back and forth between the two, between Israel, between Jews, and between Egypt and the rulers there. Sometimes the rulers were Greek, sometimes Roman, and in time there became a very large, important Jewish community in different parts of Egypt. Even, if you're going back to the First Temple period, there was a temple in Elephantine made up of Judean warriors. So this is a relationship that goes back not only in our thinking, but also in Egyptian thinking. You see the Jews and Israel and the Exodus story even come up in Egyptian writings. So this is not something that's purely a modern political relationship. But
I just have to butt in and say, of course, we're using the words Egypt and Israel basically just to kind of explain the land area that we're talking about. What is modern Egypt and what is modern Israel? We're using these terms to explain this historical relationship because obviously it wasn't called Egypt way back when. But also, I think one of the things to emphasize in this historical relationship is also the very strategic area that was the Gaza Strip. And in biblical times, it wasn't a Hebrew area. It wasn't a Jewish area. And it really wasn't for many hundreds of years. But there was some kind of Egyptian presence there. Wouldn't you agree, Lazar?
Yeah, but I would also say that, even to use the terms Israel and Egypt, if we're not talking about the modern state, these are 2 identities that go back into ancient times. So you have Roman and Greek writings that are called Egypt, and that was the name that they were talking about, and also with Israel. So modern day Egyptians feel like they are part of this people that goes back into ancient times, just like Jews and Israel do as well. So I think that's also important in the way we look at each other. But yeah, Gaza sat on that route that continued, if you're going from Egypt and you're going toward Asia, if you're going toward Europe, you would hug the sea. And you had a series of cities along that route, along the Via Maris, that traders and even obvious militaries would take. And Gaza was one of those cities. It was at different times Greek, Jewish, but also often a Philistine city, one of the main Philistine cities on the route. And it was generally actually not a port city. It was kind of a port city in the middle of the desert. The modern Gaza City port is much more recent, but it was generally a trading post that was a kilometer or more from sea, kind of in the desert. And it was kind of the place where caravans would set out toward that rich land of Egypt. So certainly Gaza, there was no Gaza Strip then. Gaza Strip is a modern creation, but the city of Gaza was an important stop in this cross-pollinization, this movement of armies, this movement of goods between what is now Israel and Egypt and that whole Nile area.
So let's do a big fast forward and get to the declaration of the State of Israel, or just thereabouts.
Yep. So we get to that period. Egypt had been under British domination since the 1880s. There would be British military officers in Egypt into the 1950s. Officially, 1922, Egypt celebrates its official independence from Britain. And it is ruled by a monarchy. There is definitely a nationalist movement, which will take over later, but they are see themselves as this ancient culture and the rightful leader of the Arab world for a number of reasons. First of all, size, it's the biggest Arab country, and also because it has institutions like Al-Azhar University, which has a claim for being kind of the Sunni, the cornerstone of the Sunni intellectual world. And it sees its rightful place as the leader of the Arab world. Obviously, one of the pressing issues for the Arab world in the late 1940s after World War II was the establishment of the State of Israel and what to do about that. Now, we know that Egypt was a key member of the coalition that invaded and tried to snuff out the nascent Jewish state. Their forces actually made it quite deep into Israel. There are monuments inside of Israel where they reached, into modern day Israel, well beyond Gaza. There was what was called the Fallujah Pocket, which was a pocket of the Egyptian army that was cut off and that Israel tried to reduce. Ultimately, there were agreements. There was armistice agreements in 1949, which set the lines between the two sides. But Egypt held on to the Gaza Strip. And throughout, even in the 40s, also in the 50s, there was a series of covert contacts between, first of all, the Jewish agency. One of the people from the Jewish agency that met with Egyptians was called David Horowitz. So you know, it's not our chief editor, but someone by that name. And some of the key figures in later Jewish history, Moshe Sharet, who was one of Israel's presidents, were involved in these quiet contacts between Egypt. Some of it was talking about the armistice and how to implement the armistice, but there was also attempts to get the Egyptian leadership to move toward a peace agreement with Israel.
But at the same time, of course, there were a lot of military operations, and this is what we would call the War of Attrition. What were the years on that?
Well, the War of Attrition is later. That's after the 67 wars. The big war that happens in the 1950s, so this is after the British are kicked out. Egypt goes through this Nasserite revolution. Nasser takes over. Gamal Abdel Nasser that's when Egypt enters its Republican era. And he has this pan-Arab vision of Arab nationalism, which he leads. And one of the things he does, which worries some Western countries, Britain and France, is that he nationalizes the Suez Canal. Suez Canal, an extremely strategic waterway, connects the Red Sea, Indian Ocean in the east with the Mediterranean. And for Israel, it's important because in the 1950s, Israel's economy is awful. It's an age of austerity. And Egypt kept trying to limit Israel's freedom of navigation in the Suez Canal. So with that nationalization, Israel understood that this could really pose a threat to its very weak economy. Egypt and France collaborated with Israel on this joint invasion of Egypt, which goes very well for Israel. This is after Israel has transitioned to a modern maneuver army, and it very quickly takes the Gaza Strip, takes the Sinai Peninsula. Funnily enough, it was American pressure under the Eisenhower administration that forced the French, English, and Israel to back off. And then Israel gives up its first occupation of Sinai in 1957 and returns to its 48 borders. Now, war breaks out again.
Just a question for you, because I'm very ignorant. When Israel backed off from Sinai, Israel also backed off from Gaza the first time, or did Israel maintain a presence? Also backed off. So Egypt filled the vacuum in Gaza again at that point.
Yes, it was never a part of the Gaza Strip. Egypt's policies were kind of inconsistent, but in general, it treated the native population of Gaza in a certain way. It treated them generally pretty well. Then the refugee population that had fled Israel in 47 to 49, but fled the areas where Israel and the Egyptian army were fighting, were given a much lower status. Interestingly enough, when Israel held the Gaza Strip in the 50s, Israel actually offered citizenship to the native population there, not to the refugees. So there was actually an offer that was rejected. But in general, yes, Egypt was there. It was the basis for Fedayeen attacks into Israel. So there was fighting going back and forth, that Egypt was able to pressure Israel with these Egyptian-backed terrorist attacks. And Israel would sometimes fight on the border, sometimes move into the Gaza Strip to fight them.
So basically, it sounds like Egypt was in control of the Gaza Strip, but definitely considered the Gazans the other. They were not considered Egyptians in any way.
Yeah, it was in Egypt's eyes supposed to be part of the Palestinian state. It was part of the British Mandate, which in Egypt's eyes should become 100% a Palestinian Arab state.
Okay, so what happens next?
The next major development is the 1967 Six-Day War. They shut down the Straits of Tiran, so they shut down the access to the Suez Canal for Israeli ships. Huge problem in terms of trade. Israel sees that as a casus belli. There's a number of reasons for the outbreak of war, but Israel understands that Egypt and its allies in Syria are preparing for war. Now, I'll just take a side note here that we talked about the Yemen insurgency and that Egypt had sent a bulk of its army actually to Yemen to fight in that insurgency, lost a lot of forces. It was basically Egypt's Vietnam. Israel cooperated with the forerunners of the current Houthi government to fight against the Egypt-backed forces, the Nasserite forces. And Egypt comes to the 67 war kind of tired from their own Vietnam. And they certainly don't perform well. Israel in June 1967 opens up a surprise attack, Operation Moked, or Focus, which takes out Egypt's air force on the ground. They also take out Syria's air force. And once they've done that, they basically won the war. It's basically a couple days of fighting in the Sinai, where Israel takes the Gaza Strip, the entire Sinai Peninsula. They take the Golan Heights from Syria, and they move into the West Bank and drive the Jordanian army across the Jordan River, taking Judea, Samaria, so it's the southern West Bank, northern West Bank, and all of Jerusalem, and absolutely remake the map of the Middle East, expand their territory several times over, and really change the balance of power in the Middle East.
Okay, and then the War of Attrition. Thank you for correcting me earlier. And then we come to 1973.
Yeah, so the War of Attrition, Egypt doesn't stop fighting. Within a year, it and Syria, and also Jordan actually, are fighting with Israel across the Suez Canal, terrorist attacks, artillery attacks, occasional bombing raids. Israel retaliates against Egypt by deeper and deeper air raids into Egypt. By 1970, when Anwar Sadat replaces Nasser, who died, that is wound down, and the War of Attrition ends in 1970. Now, Sadat is a different type of ruler. He's much more pragmatic. He doesn't have these grand plans of, being the leader of the Arab world to destroy Israel. He understands he's not going to destroy Israel. What does he want to do? He wants to get back the Sinai Peninsula, does not want back the Gaza Strip. And the way he understands to get Israel to the negotiating table, obviously Israel is in a very powerful position right now, is through war, but not a war that threatens Israel itself. But as long as they're able to invade the Sinai, take a certain piece of the territory and hold on to it, that's enough to get Israel to the negotiating table, and that is the method by which Sadat thinks that he can liberate and return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Now, there's another strategic goal here for Sadat. He wanted to move away from the Soviet bloc and move into the American sphere. That's something that the Americans wanted as well. He understood that the American sphere would give him better economic opportunities, would give him much better weapons, and the way to do that as well would be to start this process where if he makes peace with Israel, his demand of the Americans would be that the Americans start supplying them with weaponry and economic opportunities. So there's this big strategic goal that Sadat has through war, and I have to say the Egyptians pull it off perfectly in that they don't win the war militarily. They surprise Israel on October 6th by moving across the Suez Canal, capturing almost all of the Israeli outposts on the border, taking hostages, beating off the Israeli counterattack. But when they are pressured by their Syrian allies in the north to continue the attack, because Syria comes under significant military pressure by Israel that has recovered in the Golan, they say, Egypt, you need to continue the attack in the south. You need to relieve pressure on us. Once they move away from the umbrella of their anti-aircraft SAM batteries, that's exactly what Israel's waiting for. Israel absolutely picks them apart in these massive tank battles in the Sinai. Then Ariel Sharon and others famously cross the Suez Canal into Africa, and they surround the Egyptian Third Army, and that's where the war ends. With the Egyptians surrounded, America stops Israel from destroying the Egyptian army. Israel does not push into basically an undefended Cairo, and they move. It takes a few years, but they moved to 1978, where under Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin on the Israeli side, Sadat on the Egyptian side, they signed the Camp David Accords, which are officially concluded in 1979. And then there's
can I just mention in March 1979, which means this is an anniversary month, very important anniversary month.
And I want everyone to make sure that they are having parties and events later this month to mark that anniversary. But that is that's where we stand, basically. That sets the basis for a few things. One, it convinces the Arab anti-Israel bloc that there's no way to defeat Israel on the battlefield. Jordan had already dropped out basically before 1973 of the Arab fight against Israel. It sent some desultory forces to the Golan, but it wasn't serious. Jordan ends up signing the peace treaty in 94, and basically Syria's left with the fight against Israel, but they don't want to destroy Israel. Oh, they'd love to, but they can't. Their goal is to get back the Golan Heights somehow, and the fight by the hostile Arab forces to Israel, which is, Syria, Iraq, a range of terrorist groups, the Palestinians, moves to a different phase. And this is also the basis of the long-standing peace treaty between Egypt and Israel.
Okay, so now we're in this situation of what many call cold peace, but lately we're hearing reports of a buildup of the Egyptian army on the border with Israel. And so I'd like to get a sense from you, what is the Egyptian army? I mean, in terms of population of the people, we are outnumbered by infinite times. I mean, Egypt has over 100 million people, and we have something like 10 million plus minus. So what is the capability, essentially, of the Egyptian army? Can Israel still take them on?
Short answer, absolutely. Israel would absolutely win that fight. We can talk briefly about the Egyptian army. Egypt's about 11 times bigger than Israel population size. Israel spends, I think, 6 times more on their military budget. So what Israel has in terms of quantity, usually, actually, Egypt has more, but Israel has much better equipment, technology across the board. Egypt has a much more capable navy, but even so, that wouldn't be a major problem for Israel, given our advantage in terms of the Air Force. The armies are not that different in terms of size. I would say the Egyptian standing army is about 3 times bigger. The reserve force is about the same. But capabilities, the Egyptian army is really not that impressive. Have they fought any major wars recently? No. They fought most significantly these counter-terror campaigns. They fought about a decade ago, really 2014, it kicked off in earnest when an insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula turned into an ISIS insurgency. And that's when it turned into a pretty bloody fight. Egypt lost thousands of soldiers fighting these insurgents. It turned into a point of serious cooperation between the two sides, that Israel would start allowing Egypt to bring more and more forces into the Sinai Peninsula. So based on the military annex of the 1979 treaty, Egypt is very limited into the type of military forces they can introduce into the Sinai. It's basically only lightly armed border guards, that type of thing. But over the years, they kept requesting from Israel to allow tanks, APCs, attack helicopters, even some F-16s into Sinai to fight this insurgency, and Israel would allow them to. So there was the military buildup in the Sinai has gotten much bigger. And should also note that Israel also was allowed to strike insurgents, terrorists in the Sinai Peninsula by Egypt. So this is a point of serious coordination and cooperation between the two. Obviously, insurgents, ISIS and other groups in the Sinai Peninsula is not only a threat for Egypt, it's also a threat for Israel. There was terrorist attacks that killed soldiers along the border. They would fire into Eilat. So it's a mutual interest that brought the two sides much closer together about a decade ago.
Okay. But at the same time, I guess Israel's superpower is technology and the Air Force. So how is Egypt in terms of Air Force? I mean, you said the Navy is more capable than Israel's Navy. That kind of makes sense to me. But if we were to come to blows again, which I really hope we don't, would Israel's Air Force at least be more powerful? I don't even know what the word is. Would Israel's Air Force take Egypt out like we have done in previous wars?
Sure. So Egypt's Air Force is based on advanced American fighters, F-16s. It has several hundred of them. But, just having that technology, the Saudis have it, the UAE has it, they would be no match for Israel. Israel's military is fundamentally built for this type of fight against another conventional army, where it has stationary bases, it has columns of tanks moving across the desert. Think about how perfect that would be for Israel's technology. Israel can can send missiles through windows. Now, we usually think about that in terms of assassinations, but that's really built to take out moving masses of tanks moving through territory. So it would be, absolutely the kind of the dream type of war in terms of what Israel is built for. The Air Force would take out enemy air defenses. It would win in dogfights. It would take out Air Force bases. It would destroy tank columns moving slowly across this massive desert where it has nowhere to hide. And if it ever came into a tank-to-tank battle, I think that wouldn't go well for the Egyptians either. It just is not something that would serve Egypt's interest in any way. And it would be a very capable army. Israel's is obviously one of the most capable in the world, battle-tested over the past year and a half against a military that has not proven itself and that has not fought in a long time and that has some good equipment but doesn't really have much else.
Okay, that is very reassuring. So now let's take the conversation into Egypt's role as mediator. In the past decade, at least, Israel has utilized Egypt as a mediator for any kind of talks with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad in all the very many wars or mini warettes that we've had within the Gaza Strip over the past, as I said, decade. So is Egypt a fair mediator in terms of who is it representing?
It's a good question. So certainly our interests and Egypt's interests don't line up entirely, right? Let's lay a few things out. First of all, Egypt sees Hamas as an adversary. Egypt's big enemy is the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas's roots are in the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt sees Hamas as part of that Muslim Brotherhood movement. It defines the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And when it was fighting that bloody insurgency in the Sinai, Egypt believes that there was constant contact between Hamas and ISIS terrorists, and that they would even use Gaza as kind of a strategic rare area to get medical care, to even get weapons. So it sees Hamas as, as an enemy. At the same time, it's no, there's no great love for Israel, and Hamas is Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are ways to pressure Israel to do things that Egypt wants. But in general, Egypt's interests are that there will be quiet, there will be stability there, that it doesn't have to worry about, certainly doesn't have to worry about Palestinians flooding into the Sinai. In 2008, Hamas blew up the border fence between Gaza and Egypt, and up to 700,000, maybe even more, Palestinians, Gazans moved into the Sinai Peninsula. You can imagine what that did for the contacts between Hamas and tribes in the Sinai. It's not something that they want to see again. So their interest is that there's stability. They try to wrap these wars, these operations between Israel and Hamas up as quickly as possible. And they haven't necessarily wanted to see Israel defeat Hamas. That's if they could snap their fingers, Hamas would be gone. But even now, their first interest is to make sure that masses of Gazan civilians are not pushed into Egypt. And you've seen throughout the war that has made them very nervous. And they're trying to wind up this war. This war threatens them for a number of reasons. 25% of their GDP comes from tourism. Obviously, not a lot of tourists going now into Egypt. It shuts down doesn't shut down, but it damages the trade into the Suez Canal. That's another major source of revenue, of foreign currency. And Egypt has serious economic challenges. Food prices are spiraling, inflation, unemployment. It has very complex challenges with Sudan. It has a fight with Ethiopia over this dam that they're building on the Blue Nile. Libya, has that conflict that Egypt has been very much involved in. So it has serious challenges, and it doesn't need this challenge, this threat from the Northeast. It wants to see this wrapped up quickly, and it wants to see its relationship with the U.S. improve. That's where it's trying to position itself as a mediator, to whatever it can do to get a ceasefire, to whatever it can do to make sure Gazans are not kicked out of the Gaza Strip, and to show that to the U.S. that it is a reliable mediator.
So with this new proposal that we just are debating this week because of the conference in Cairo, where the proposal from Egypt was adopted by most of the Arab world, it looks like, it appears that it's everything that you just said. It allows Hamas to live on. It would shut down the conflict and create some kind of illusion of peace on the border again. But it's just mind-boggling to me that they would propose such a thing, because it just, for the long run, for Egypt as well, it's just not a good plan. I'm so stammering because of my disbelief in this proposal, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a plan. Well, first of all, it came out quickly because they had to react to Trump's demand and his threat that he would make Egypt and Jordan take in Gazans. And again, that's a red line for both countries. But you saw Jordan's king go to the White House and try to deal with it through engagement with the White House. Sisi did not do that. So their approach was to show that there is a Arab-backed, even UN-backed plan for the future of Gaza. Yeah, but they don't mention Hamas. They don't deal with how do you get Hamas out of there. It's really not the most realistic plan. But now they can say we have one, Israel doesn't have one, America has one that's not realistic. It's kind of a pie-in-the-sky thing. It talks about smart cities and walkability and the shape of arches that reflect Palestinian heritage. but it really has nothing to do with the main challenge on the ground, which is the challenge of Hamas and its rule of the Gaza Strip.
Okay, Lazar, let's put that slightly to the side. And one last final big picture question. Obviously, Egypt was a great enemy of Israel. And since, as we said, March 1979, there's been this treaty, which resulted in cold peace. Do you think that this could be some kind of blueprint for finding peace with, for example, Lebanon or Syria? Is there any lesson learned from this for those countries too?
I think in general, a lesson learned, and especially with our Abraham Accords partners, is that we don't want to let these agreements deteriorate into cold peace. There was a vision of economic relationship, social relationship, cultural relationship, which just didn't happen. A lot of that is because Egypt prevents it. But we have to make sure that we are incentivizing and focusing on the economic side when we make peace with countries. And I think that's Israeli diplomats are very cognizant of that with the Abraham Accords. We have to see how we can get that to be an important element of our peace with Egypt. Natural gas is the big one. So, we provide Egypt with a significant amount of its natural gas. It had some serious energy shortages last summer. So that's increasingly important. And our way to get our natural gas to Europe right now is through Egyptian LNG stations. So that's an important economic bind. We're both in the East Med Gas Forum. We have to see how we maintain that, expand that, but we also have to see how we can get other aspects of the economic relationship to expand. And, whether it's, tax-free zones, tariff-free zones, all sorts of incentives there are for both sides to work together. If ever there is peace with Lebanon and or Syria, I expect it to be a much warmer peace, a much more comprehensive peace. Lebanon is a place we had briefly a peace agreement with, and there's certainly a big part of the population which is sympathetic to us. That is not the case in Egypt. And Syria, too, are finding allies amongst the very diverse Syrian population. So I think it'll be different, and I think it would be a shame. It'll be good if it lasts as long as the peace agreement, as stable as it's been with Egypt, but it'll be a shame if it is only kind of a security relationship and not one that's broader.
Lazar, I have learned so much. As always, I really appreciate all of your insights. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel Friday Focus. Please check out and subscribe to the channel Friday Focus if you'd like more of these conversations, slightly schmoozy and also incredibly informative. Until next week, thank you very much. Shalom.